Greetings and shalom. This is Adrian Scott, and welcome to Truth and Testimony, the broadcast. It's time for another edition of Bible Break, and we are continuing our reading in the book of Genesis, and we'll be picking up with Genesis chapter 7. Now, not as many topics in this video as there was in the last one, but I'd say one or two big topics. So without any further ado, let's get straight into the reading, and then we will come back and discuss it. Genesis chapter 7, picking up at verse 1. And the Lord said unto Noah, Come thou and all thy house into the ark, for thee have I seen righteous before me in this generation. Of every clean beast thou shalt take to thee by sevens, the male and his female, and of beasts that are not clean by two, the male and his female. Of fowls also of the air by sevens, the male and the female, to keep seed alive upon the face of all the earth. For yet 7 days, and I will cause it to rain upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights, and every living substance that I have made will I destroy from off the face of the earth. And Noah did according unto all that the Lord commanded him. And Noah was 600 years old when the flood waters was upon the earth. And Noah went in, and his sons, and his wife, and his sons' wives with him into the ark because of the waters of the flood. Of clean beasts, and of beasts that are not clean, and of fowls, and of everything that creepeth upon the earth, there went in two and two unto Noah into the ark, the male and the female, as God had commanded Noah. And it came to pass after 7 days that the waters of the flood were upon the earth. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. And the rain was upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. In the selfsame day entered Noah and Shem and Ham and Japheth, the sons of Noah, and Noah's wife, and the 3 wives of his sons with them into the ark. They and every beast after his kind, and all the cattle after their kind, and every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth after his kind, and every fowl after his kind, every bird of every sort. And they went in unto Noah into the ark, 2 and 2 of all flesh, wherein is the breath of life. And they that went in male and female of all flesh, as God had commanded him, and the Lord shut him in. And the flood was 40 days upon the earth, and the waters increased, and bare up the ark, and it was lift up above the earth. And the waters prevailed, and were increased greatly upon the earth, and the ark went upon the face of the waters. And the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and all the high hills that were under the whole heaven were covered. 15 cubits upward did the waters prevail, and the mountains were covered. And all flesh died that moved upon the earth, both of fowl and of cattle and of beast, and of every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth, and every man. All in whose nostrils was the breath of life, of all that was in the dry land, died. And every living substance was destroyed which was upon the face of the ground, both man and cattle, and the creeping things, and the fowl of the heaven. And they were destroyed from the earth. And Noah only remained alive, and they that were with him in the ark. And the waters prevailed upon the earth 150 days. So there we have it, Genesis chapter 7. Okay, so a couple things to touch on. The first one will take us back to verse 2, really, and 3, I guess, where it mentions every clean beast and of beasts that are not clean. So the interesting thing that I like to observe here is when we're talking about clean and unclean, we're talking about stuff that's acceptable for food and stuff that is not. Now, if it means something else above and beyond that, so be it. But it at least means that. And I think it should be duly noted that this is well before the giving of the law at Mount Sinai to Moses. So there already was a distinction between clean and unclean animals for the purpose of eating. And why 7? Well, because you had to feed everyone. You had to be able to breed enough to not just feed the people on the ark, but certainly all the animals. They needed sustenance for the amount of time that they were floating around, because they sure weren't getting off the boat to go get it. So that's why 7. And then 2, which was enough to just reproduce. Now, I mentioned in the previous video this idea that you don't need 2 of every variation of animals, that all you need, as it states over and over again in chapter 6 and chapter 7, is 2 of each kind. Because I would say the DNA for all those variations are within those 2, certainly at that point. It's been long enough now, you could make a case that, the integrity of DNA has eroded and it is not as clean and pure as it once was. Certainly not at this point. Well, that's not even the right way to put it, because I do think that there was a twisting of that DNA. Now, we mentioned that in the previous video as well, this twisting of DNAs. But you could still say that ultimately the DNA started pure or more intact, more with more integrity than it is now, but it was twisted. Now, I would say not necessarily so much with the animals. However, that you could even make an argument there, because I also make the case that as man became more twisted and more evil and more violent, that it has a trickle-down effect on the rest of creation, as I do think that creation is more intertwined and interconnected than a lot of people might realize. More than I realize. I speculate on that, but I suspect that it's there. So really, that kind of was the point of just the fact that long before we got the law at Mount Sinai given to Moses, we already had a distinction between clean and unclean beasts. Now, this gets into the next part, which is kind of interesting, and it really touches on a theory. I'm going to have a few other videos, and I'm going to put the links for them down below. So I do encourage always to go check out those videos. There's some great stuff in there, and it's going to go more in depth than I can here. Because honestly, I do a lot of this. I pre-plan some of it, but I'm doing a lot of this off the top of my head. So I'm just trying to go by memory here. But in this next area, it talks about this idea of the flood itself. Now, there's a couple of points to make with that. The first one touches on the idea of how did we get that much water to flood the entirety of the planet? Actually, maybe I should back up and kind of touch on the other topic first. So there is a school of thought within theology, within biblical theology, that it wasn't a global flood and that it was instead a localized flood. To me, I've never understood that one, and I think that that's someone trying too hard to fit something else into biblical theology rather than letting the Bible interpret itself. So they're trying to combine ideas, and I think the idea is trying to combine, the idea of millions and billions of years of evolution into Scripture, which, if you read Genesis, as we're doing, seems to indicate 6 literal days of creation. And the morning and the evening were the second day, and the morning and the evening were the third day, etc., etc. How that all works, I can't say for sure, but I'm just going on what the Bible says. So either it's 6 literal days or the Bible is wrong. And I don't think the Bible's wrong, so therefore I go with 6 literal days. But they do try to fit these other ideas in there. And it makes no sense to me. For one thing, it talks about how all the fowls and the creeping creatures and the cattle and man were all destroyed, when if it was a localized flood, all they ultimately had to do was go over that hill where there isn't a flood. Just move to the area where there isn't a flood. Yeah, I see a lot of inconsistencies with that, and it's not one that I looked at it when I was first learning, but I pretty quickly dismissed it because it just, based on a plain reading of the Bible, made no sense at all to me. Either the judgment was on all of creation or it was only on these small regions. That doesn't make any sense. And so in order to wipe everything out, it had to be a global flood. Now, this gets back to the other point, which is, where did all this water come from? Now, there's a great theory. One of the guys that I've always liked, very controversial figure, I acknowledge. And I don't agree with everything he said. I don't agree with all of his theology. However, as far as like scientific elements go, I've always really valued his opinion and input on stuff. And he's the one that kind of shifted my thinking from being an evolutionist to being a biblical believer. But his name is Kent Hovind, Dr. Kent Hovind. And he did he did a seminar series, which was 7 or 8 different seminars. One of them was titled The Hovind Theory. And in this, he actually goes into a significant amount of detail explaining how the global flood may have occurred. And as he points out, we can't say for certain, but it's a solid enough theory. It's at least plausible. It holds true to scientific principles, and it makes sense. It makes sense. So if God or Yeshua at some point wants to come and correct me and say, no, that wasn't quite right, I'm happy to be corrected on that one. But until then, it is kind of the theory that I follow. And so the basic idea, I'm putting a link to his seminar down below. It is available online, but I'll put a link to it down below. I'm just going to very much kind of loosely summarize it. So the idea was, because it mentions waters being above the heavens or waters above the firmament and waters beneath the firmament. Now, the firmament could be airspace as well as ground. So just basically the earthly realm, right? So the theory makes the idea or proposes the idea that there may have been a canopy of ice of some kind around the world at that point. Now, what this would have done is, for one thing, it would have filtered out a bunch of pollutants and stuff. So the atmosphere would have been very clean. It would have been kept very temperate, and it would have basically been a big global hyperbaric oxygen chamber in a sense. So it would allow things to grow very healthily, to grow long, to grow large, which would, explain dinosaurs and other things like that. But so ultimately that there was potentially this canopy of ice or frozen water above the surface of the world. And we do actually see phenomenon to that effect. I think it was mentioned in an example of when one or more of the space shuttles were launching, that the fuel would liquefy as it was burning, and it would freeze and it would hover, I think he was saying, over the magnetic poles. So being held up by the magnetic current, but that it was floating above the atmosphere. So if you have it covering the entire planet, that would give you a lot of benefits, and it would explain waters above the firmament. Then waters beneath the firmament could just be subterranean chambers, which we know we still have today. I mean, that's where we draw a lot of wells from and stuff like that. But the idea would be that when the floods happened, that it says the fountains of the great deep, where was it? Let's see if I can find it there. It is in verse 11. When it says, in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. So from a slightly scientific standpoint, because I'm not a scientist, I just play one on TV, you'd have fractures in the crust of the earth, creating these fault lines, which we see evidence of today. I find it interesting that a lot of those fault lines line up with the various mountain ranges around the planet. So could it be that the fountains of the great deep burst open. Water started pushing out through all of that. And as this land was broken up, it started pushing apart. Now, on the outside of this land, it's going to start piling up, and that would form the mountain ranges potentially. So the waters come bursting out of there. Now, what's one thing we know about is when you get really heavy rain or a lot of rain, it tends to warm up the atmosphere because there's a degree of friction going on. With that much water, you'd be generating, I theorize, more friction. So now you've got increased heat on the planet, which could melt those frozen canopy that was above the planet. So now that comes down. You've got all of this water. That's ultimately where the Great Flood came from. And there's a lot of other things that this flood idea connects to. I don't want to get into it in this video because I'm just kind of trying to talk about Genesis chapter 7, but it touches on ideas of radiocarbon dating and other dating methods, and just trying to come up with where they come up with these bizarre numbers for the age of the earth and the age of everything, right? That in so doing, they're making a lot of assumptions that the environment was always the same, that it wasn't different at some point. And they're just making a lot of guesswork based on a lot of stuff. But one thing that the effect of this global flood would have done is thrown all of those norms out the window. Because, I mean, this is the most catastrophic event to have happened on this planet. Period. Bar none. There's just nothing else that even comes close. So that alone would indicate that you didn't have uniform numbers. So could it be that, rates of decay in different elements, or the amounts of those elements, would have been different at a period in the past? And there's lots of little evidences that lend itself to support that idea. I'll leave you to research that stuff if you want to, but it touches on a lot of stuff. But back to Genesis 7, I mean, it's that idea that, again, recapping, a localized flood rather than a global flood makes no sense to me. Had to be a global flood. How could that global flood have happened? Well, I've given you the one very skeleton summary of potential ideas. And again, if you find that at all interesting, with that link that I'm putting down below, it's a full, at least hour and a half. It might be a bit more seminar from Dr. Kent Hovind on this Hovind theory. And I really encourage you to check it out. He gets into a lot more science. He actually puts some numbers to it, and it makes sense. To me, he's at least internally consistent with known laws of science. The second law of thermodynamics and other things like that, that tie into all this. So it's plausible, absolutely plausible. And if you follow that theory and say, okay, well, what would the result of it look like? And then look at the world today, what you see in the world today lines up with that. So I find that interesting as well. The last thing I think I would bring up is just this idea, because I've heard some people make this argument about how much water it would take to put Mount Everest underwater. And that would take an unbelievable amount of water. I don't think it's possible. So the idea that I have is, at that point that the global flood occurred, there wasn't anything like Mount Everest. That was a result. I mentioned the plates breaking apart and the waters bursting forth and they pushing apart and forming mountain ranges. That's where Mount Everest came from. That's where the Himalayas came from. That's before that. So the idea is, before that, mountains were not as big. And so it wouldn't have required as much water to submerge everything. As it starts draining off and the effect of everything, now you see it all pile up. And because again, you have to try to even conceive of how catastrophic this global flood was, the amount of damage. And that ties into another thought. And I think on this one, I'll start to wrap it up, where I've mentioned that, what is this global flood? It's God's judgment on the world, on man in particular, but on the world, which had become wicked and corrupted and twisted for whatever the cause was. I have my theory, but it was his judgment. So when we look out there today, and we can see some amazingly what we think of, beautiful scenes, tree-capped mountains and all these rolling hills and plains and all these different things that we would say is very beautiful. And I'm not saying they aren't, but that is a junkyard compared to how the world was before the global flood. Just to throw that idea out there. Anyways, I'm not going to belabor it too long, so we'll kind of conclude it there with Genesis chapter 7. As always, I do encourage you, if you like the video, please give it a thumbs up, give it a punch if you're on Rumble, and share it with others, because we're trying to get this information out there, Ray and I. And if you have not yet done so, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell, the notifications, so that you are notified whenever Ray or I upload content to the channel. And until the next video, where we will pick up in Genesis chapter 8, I will say blessings to you all in the name of Yeshua HaMashiach, Jesus our Savior. And I say shalom and bye for now.